Well, good morning. I hope that you are enjoying your weekend so far and the beginning to a new week. I am convinced that there's no better way to start a new week than worshiping with our brothers and sisters and worshiping God. I want to thank Ryan last week for filling in. We were at Pee Wee Weekend at church camp. If any of you want to know what Pee Wee Weekend is, one word: chaos. But we survived, and thank you for letting us be there and surviving that. Ryan for filling in. This month, we've talked about 1 Corinthians 7, and that's what we're going to keep doing, is look at 1 Corinthians 7 again. And really, the whole of 1 Corinthians 7 is based on this idea of marriage, what marriage looks like, and our responsibilities in our marriage, the purpose of marriage, and we've looked at all of those so far. But when we get to the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we begin this new section. So it's chapter 7, it's divided up very nicely for us because we begin in verse 1 with our first in 1 Corinthians, with our first now concerning passage. Obviously, marriage is something that they are asking about. And we begin this particular passage in verse 25 with another now concerning passage. So this is it's again in the whole theme of marriage and our relationship with our spouse, or here with our fiancé, our betrothed, or those who have passed on. What do we do? So here, what we're looking at, beginning in verse 25 and moving through the rest of the chapter, before we get to the next now concerning passage, we're talking about being single. That is, those who aren't married. And there's a few reasons as to why someone is not married. We're talking about those who are in the process of being married. You know, what should you do if you are engaged to someone to be married and you become a Christian? Should your commitment be to your fiance, or should your commitment be to God? This is what we're talking about. Or perhaps your spouse has left you. They've left you and they've divorced you. What should you do now at this point in your life? Or perhaps another situation, your spouse has passed on. What do you do in 1 Corinthians chapter 7? This is what we're looking at. When you find yourself single and wanting to serve God. So this is the gist of 1 Corinthians 7. And let me tell you, it is, from my perspective, it has been extremely difficult. One of the more difficult sermons to gather up and to arrive at what the meaning is and what to talk about. So my grandfather, who preached for a very, very long time, he said, as long as you have Bible in your sermon, you know that part's right. Now, the other parts, that's what you got to worry about. So what we're going to do, as we've done before, is we're going to simply read through 1 Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 24. We're going to break it up into a couple of different sections, and we're going to draw some different conclusions. And then as we look at a few points from each of these passages, we're going to draw some applications. So that's what you have to look forward to. And the first idea, beginning here in verse 25, is that we ought to, as you are single, or you find yourself in a freshly unmarried state, what do you do? Step one, prioritize. You've got to make sure that your priorities are where they ought to be, that you are doing what you ought to be doing. Now, again, you know, we're talking about people who are divorced. We're talking about people who are unmarried. We're talking about people who are engaged. What do you do? But let me tell you, these points in this passage, and especially these applications, they apply to all of us. Step one, prioritize. Get your life right. Make sure that you're focusing on the right thing. So let's begin by reading verse 25 through verse 31. It says this, "Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good that for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you of that. This is," in verse 29, "this is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal in the world as they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away." Now, reading this passage, you could understand my struggles. It's like, what on earth? But I think that the gist of what he's saying is make sure that your priorities are where they need to be. Make sure that you are focused on God. Whether you're single or whether you're married or whatever state you're in, make sure that you are focused on the right thing. If you don't make it your goal to get married, right? I mean, shouldn't we have bigger goals in life than that? And don't make it your goal in life to be single. Make sure that your priorities are what they ought to be. But there's a few things that I want to point out from this passage that may be a little strange or alarming, or you may have questions about. He says, based on this, in verse 26, this whole passage kind of hinges, in my opinion, on verse 26. He says that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. First question is, what are we talking about? What is that present distress? And as many commentaries as you read, you're going to come up with as many different conclusions as to what that present distress is. But generally, the consensus is starvation, for instance. Because we know that in this area, as Paul was writing, there was about to be a severe famine. And with a severe famine comes starvation. And when you, and maybe you lived through the Great Depression, which I suppose is probably the closest thing that we have to compare it to. But when you live through an era like that, you begin to worry, don't you? You begin to worry about what are we going to eat? I mean, the next meal on our table, what is it going to be? So I wish, because of this present distress, maybe it is a severe famine that is coming on the land. Or maybe it's about persecution. We know that the church in Corinth was severely persecuted. We know that because of the pagan worship that was running rampant in Corinth in this day, that there was an extreme amount of persecution. Or maybe the present distress is not that. Maybe it's not persecution of the church. Maybe it's not starvation or a severe famine. Maybe it's, as some people write, a decade later or so, the destruction of Jerusalem. When all these Christians in the city of Jerusalem, they were forced to either die or to flee. Maybe that's what we're talking about. Some people draw the conclusion, based on a few other hints here in this passage, that what he is talking about is the second coming. He's talking about the resurrection here when Jesus comes back. Now, I'm not inclined to think that it's the destruction of Jerusalem as he's writing to the church in Corinth. Nor am I inclined to think that it is this second coming that's in view here. Personally, I think it's more of a tangible thing that was very, very close. such as a famine. I'll give you my 2 cents. You can draw your own conclusion, and we can be friends afterwards. But whatever it is, don't let that distract you from serving God. Whether it's a famine, don't worry about it. Or it's a persecution, don't worry about it. Prioritize. Make sure that you are living the way that you ought to live. But you can imagine with all of these, perhaps the inclination to, man, it's better if I don't have any children. It's better if I don't have a spouse. So I don't have to worry about them as I'm going through something like this. Therefore, there's one more thing we have as we begin in verse 29. He says, the time has grown very short. And from now on, he says 5 examples. He gives us 5 examples as to what you must do, what you ought to live, how you ought to live. He says, from now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. All right, fellas. Careful. That's all I'm going to say. Careful. And those who mourn as though they were not mourning. Those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing. Those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal in the world as though they had no dealings with it. So essentially, what he's telling us is these 5 different examples. Live as if you don't have a wife. Live as if you're not mourning. Live as though you're not rejoicing. Live as though you have no dealings in the world, or as you have no goods in this world. Now, what is he talking about? Again, it's a little puzzling. But I believe the conclusion is the answer. The form of this world is passing away. That's why I don't think it's the resurrection, because he says the form of this world as you know it, is going to pass away. So why would you focus? Why would you focus on your wife? Why would you focus on mourning or grieving? Why would you focus on rejoicing and being glad? Why would you focus on the goods in this world? Why would you focus on these things that have no bearing on your eternal soul? Prioritize. Now, let's stop. Let's make sure that our priorities are straight. And let's draw some applications from this. I believe one conclusion that we can draw is that, and so many of us can testify to this, is that life changes. And life changes so fast and so frequently, but God doesn't. So that life is going to continue to move on. We might be at a state in life where it seems as if our world is collapsing all around. But guess what? Everybody else in this world, their life still goes on. And it changes with every event in life. It changes. It morphs into something different. But the good news is that God never changes. Is that there is a constant, that you can always go to Him, and that He will always be there for you. I've got my best friend growing up, best man in my wedding, Joseph. I know that when I go home, Joseph is still going to be there because Joseph never leaves. But he's always there. I know that if anything in life goes wrong or anything else happens, guess what? I can go to Joseph. Maybe you've got a friend like that. Maybe you've got a friend that you can always turn to and that they've always been there. Ever since you were a little kid, they were always there. I've known Joseph since I was 2. We did everything together. And I know that he is always going to be there. Guess what? Life changes. Life gets different very quickly. But God doesn't change. In my opinion, one of the most comforting passages in the book of Hebrews is found in the very last chapter. In Hebrews chapter 13, it says this in verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus is not going to change. Joseph has changed. He's changed quite a bit. Life has continued for him, but Jesus has not changed. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he will always be there for you. You can always turn to him. You can always look at him, and he will always and forever listen. You need somebody to talk to. You need somebody to cry out to. You need somebody that will listen to you. Turn to Jesus. Life, the present form of this world, is going to change. What you are experiencing right now in this life is going to be different than what you're going to experience 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there was no such thing as Pride Month, right? I mean, this is a relatively new discovery that we have, Pride Month. Life changes, doesn't it? Roe versus Wade. Guess what? 10 years ago, that was still in effect. Life changes, but God does not. I'm so thankful that God, he's never going to change, and he's always going to be there for me. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 7. Let's look at this next passage. I believe it hinges on this idea of focusing on the right thing. We've got prioritizing and making sure that our priorities are where they ought to be, but focusing on the right thing, beginning in verse 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried and betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to God. Now, you remember what we said back in verse 29. Let those who have wives live as though they had none. That's why I said be careful. Because now we're seeing the married man is anxious about how to please his wife. Remember? Right? I mean, that's all the married guys, that's all you think about, isn't it? Is my wife going to be happy about this? Is my wife going to care about this? Am I going to make it right? I guess I'm the only one. Y'all need to learn from me. And I know that my wife is only concerned about making me happy, making sure that I am content, making sure that my needs are met, the things that I desire. Ladies, right? Y'all need to talk to Brittany, okay? We do have the perfect marriage. That's a joke. Here, we go back to verse 29, and we read verse 32 through 35. It is very important that we make sure that we consider all the facts, because it would be extremely easy to pick out this passage and to say, look, Brittany, your only concern in life should be me, because that's in the Bible, right? And it would be very easy for her to point a finger at me and say, hey, look, I just read that your only concern in life should be about me. But that's not what it's talking about. Make sure that we toe the line, that we walk according to the whole passage, right? Look at what it says in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25. You remember this? Because it would be easy, we're looking at this, and it would be easy to say, the wives, you should live, or the husbands, you should live as though you had no wife. And we come to a passage like this in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 25, and it says, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is life not more than food, and the body more than clothing? Now we could tell our wives, why are you buying more clothes? Why are you going shopping? Don't you have clothes? Don't you have, right? Isn't life more than going to the mission store and buying clothes? Isn't life more important than that? And then we read a passage like this one in 1 Timothy. Now, we are talking about if your mother or your father or your mother-in-law or your father-in-law becomes a widow, how you should take care of them. But I believe the application to our present idea is still the same here in 1 Timothy. I've got a 1 Timothy around here somewhere. 1 Timothy 5. Look at this, beginning in verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. You see the importance of balance? Because you could say, I'm not going to give you anything because we need to be focused on God. But if you take that in conjunction with 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, it is important that we take care of our family, isn't it? That we do provide food for them, that we do provide shelter, that we provide them with these clothes. Here is, I believe, an application, or maybe the application, back in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Is that what is good, and God saw that man was alone. So God created a helper for him. The marriage institution is from God. It is good. But what is good can become bad. You understand? If we allow our marriages to be the center of our life rather than God, they become a stumbling block to our Christianity. And it's the same thing with everything in life, isn't it? It's the same thing with your job. It's the same thing with your hobbies or the things that you enjoy or school or whatever it is. Those are good things. But when we allow good things to come in between our relationship with God, we have done a bad thing. So don't let what is good become bad by losing focus. Focus on what's right. Prioritize. Then let's keep going here and begin in verse 36 with me. Here's our point. Everyone is usable. No matter what state you are in, no matter your status in life, God has the ability to use you. You're usable. Usable to God. Sorry, that's my fault. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. You've got two obviously contrasting states in life, the married and the unmarried. Both can be used by God. If you become a Christian while you are engaged and you marry, that's good. But if you choose in your heart to not marry, he says that's even better. Now again, this is my personal opinion. I think it all hinges back on verse 26. In view of the present distress, it's better that you don't marry. But before Paul introduces this present distress, read this with me in chapter 7 still. Look at verse 7 and verse 8. He says, I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. I wish that everyone were like me. I wish that everyone were single so that we would have undivided devotion to God. From time to time, we get the woe is me mentality, don't we? We begin to think to ourselves, if I can't do what so-and-so is doing because so-and-so is in a better place in life than I am. Or they have this and I don't have that. There is very few things in life that eat me up more than when someone says that they can't do it. And they give some excuse as to why they can't. That's the way that I grew up. I would tell at 8 years old, changing the oil in my dad's truck, I would tell him there's this bolt, those of you who haven't been there, that you have to get off. And I would every once in a while, I'd say, Dad, I just can't get it off. And he would peek under the truck and he would tell me, don't tell me you can't do it, and walk off. Don't tell me you can't. Whatever situation in life you are in, whether you're single or whether you're married or whatever you are, don't tell me that you can't, because God can use everybody. God, every single person is usable to God. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter the status of your relationship. God can use you if you are usable. What does that require? Submission. Give your life to God, and God can use you. Are you willing to work? Are you willing to do it? Are you willing to put forth the effort? Then God can use you. But don't begin to give me these excuses. Well, I can't do this because so-and-so. Stop it. Do what you can. We're not asking you to do X. Do what you can. Because God can use you if you're willing to let Him. I think Paul's point, this is my opinion, I think Paul's point of the second half of chapter 7, when he's talking about these people who are single, I believe it's focusing on this idea that we need to make sure that our priorities are right, that we are focused on God, that we're not focused on marriage or a relationship, and that we make ourselves available to God, that we are usable to Him. Now, I don't know where you're at in life. I don't know what's going on in your relationship or in your relationship with God. But I do know with all my heart that if you give yourself to God, if you're baptized, have your sins washed away, and you begin walking for Him, that He will use you if you let Him. That if your focus is on getting to heaven, if your priorities are godly priorities, He'll use you. It doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how young you are. Let God use you. So if you're single or if you're married or whatever the status is, if you need help from God, if you need strength or comfort, if you need prayers from the church, I want to encourage you to come as we stand and as we sing.